Hello. Today I'll be giving my thoughts on the first arc of Battle Angel Alita, the Makaku arc. I had planned to have this out shortly after doing my chapter reviews, but I've had a lot going on, so I decided to hold on to it until I was ready to start my Arc 2 videos. If you want to see my chapter-by-chapter reviews for this arc, see the playlist for chapters 1 through 7. Originally, I had thought to do these roundup reviews by volume, but then I realized a volume isn't really easy to treat as a whole story. Case in point, the last chapter of the Makaku arc is actually the first chapter of Volume 2. There's some pretty critical stuff in that last chapter, so it seemed like I was handicapping myself for no real reason by cutting it out. The other side of this was just realizing that the volumes themselves are kind of arbitrary. The newest English editions actually divide the original series into 6 volumes instead of 9, so Volume 1 contains 9 chapters instead of 6. With that out of the way, let's get into the substance of the video. The Makaku arc is the first arc of the series, and thus has a lot of legwork to do. It has to draw people in, convince them this is a series to keep reading, establish characters, settings, and plot. Maybe they don't have to get an overarching plot going right away, but some hints at overall goals and conflicts for the characters we're following. On the whole, the Makaku arc succeeds in that regard by using the exploration of the characters to explore the setting of the scrapyard, and vice versa. I'll explain what I mean by that, but first, I just want to establish a basic summary of the arc. Now, the Makaku arc, in which I'm including Chapter 1, even though it's sort of standalone, is the story of an amnesiac cyborg girl, Alita, who is found in a junkyard by Dr. Daisuke Ito. They live in the scrapyard, a dystopia of poverty and moral decay controlled for the benefit of Zalem, a floating city above. Alita is revealed to have the combat skills of Panzerkunst, a Martian martial art, which leads to her becoming a bounty hunter, called a hunter-warrior. Through that profession, Alita is made to confront the worst of the scrapyard's criminals, namely, Makaku, a brutal, cannibalistic, brain-devouring cyborg with a penchant for body theft. Through their conflict, both have their bodies destroyed, and both get an upgrade. Makaku steals the body of one of the scrapyard's most powerful warriors, Kanuba, while Alita is given a piece of old advanced technology called a berserker. They clash first in the Kansas bar, and then in the sewers, where Alita ultimately triumphs over her enemy, but learns the tragic story of his life in the process. That's the quick summary. I'm sort of skating over the story of the first chapter, but feel free to check out my Chapter 1 video. In short, I think it did a pretty good job of introducing the scrapyard as this dark industrial hellscape, oozing moral degeneracy and violence, all beneath the enigmatic presumed utopia of Zalem. It also cements Alita's place in the world, her relationships, her skills, and her willingness to stand up to the dangers of the scrapyard. But this isn't just the Alita introduction arc, this is the Makaku arc, so I should really talk about that disgusting and horrifying villain. Now I have to say that on my first read, I was not really a big fan of Makaku as a villain. I thought he was gross, and the backstory revealed at the end of the arc makes it seem like I'm supposed to feel sorry for Makaku. But I didn't. He's a cannibalistic serial killer that brutalizes Alita, nearly kills Ito, kidnaps a baby, and is just generally disgusting. No amount of tragic backstory was going to make me feel sympathetic. However, on this latest read-through, I started thinking about what he represented in the story, and what he meant as a character. I started to like him a lot more. I'll explain why. More than probably any other adversary Alita faces in the original series, Makaku most deserves to be called a monster. He's cruel and sadistic to an extreme. He's a savage brute on a rampage, literally devouring those weaker than him. Makaku's role in the story is a sort of ultimate byproduct of the scrapyard's corruption. He was discarded at birth and scrounged his existence from the waste and cast-off corruption of the scrapyard. It's tempting to look at the obvious symbolism of Zalem oppressing the scrapyard and only think of the concrete, direct examples of it, but the scrapyard isn't a community of caring people whose misery comes only from the direct cruelty of Zalem. There's a deeper level of sickness here. By Makaku's own words, he's dealt with the pain and fear inflicted upon him by inflicting it upon others. All the suffering he's endured in his life is reflected by him back into the world, amplified. The people of the scrapyard are the same. All the hardship visited upon them by Zalem, all the cruelties they inflict on one another, it has a corrupting effect. We're shown in various scenes that people in the scrapyard will ignore a bleeding man clearly in need of help. We're shown that cruelty and vicious violence are regular occurrences. Existing below the scrapyard itself, Makaku receives that cruelty and redirects it back into the world, which of course only makes things worse. We see how people who might be able to do something about him won't because they're too afraid. Makaku is vile and disgusting because this world is vile and disgusting. It's a whole feedback loop of violence and cruelty. That's what makes it more impactful when Alita stands up to him. In contrast to Makaku, her first experience in this world was kindness from Ito, and she stands up to Makaku not for material gain, but to discover something about herself and a sense of justice. She stands in opposition not just to Makaku, but the corruption and cruelty of the world that created him. She rejects the idea that people are doomed by that environment. She rejects fatalism. She has faith that people can choose their own paths and destiny. The reason Makaku feels some twisted form of love for Alita is because her ideals represent hope and freedom. She proves to him that she isn't like others in the scrapyard, and she is proof against his own fatalistic view that he was doomed from the start. She means that a better world than the one he's experienced can exist. That isn't all of it, though. When we get down to the core of Makaku, we find he was driven by his fear of dying alone with nobody knowing or caring. This happened to him once before, though he was saved. Afterward, he had to make people care about his existence, even if it comes in the form of hatred and fear, the only emotions he really experienced for or from others before. He reflects the cruelty he experienced back into the world as a way of forcing others to acknowledge his existence. Yet despite that, he was still alone. Then along comes Alita, who responds to him not with fear, but resolve. She disrupts his understanding of the world. When Makaku tries to assert that she's just after the bounty on his head, she rejects that motivation. She fights for people she cares about. She fights to understand herself. This warrior that rejects the petty motivations of the scrapyard means the world doesn't have to be as cruel as he thinks it is. He responds to her the same way he responds to everything else, with violence and cruelty, but this vendetta is also in a way the closest he's ever been with another human. That's why he's not just talking about killing her when he discusses his plans for her. He wants to keep her close in his sadistic way, wearing her tortured form as a pendant. Failing that, he tries to kill them both together. He doesn't want to be rid of her, quite the opposite. He wants to keep her around. That isn't really what he wanted, though. In the end, Alita extends a degree of compassion to Makaku, attempting to understand him in his last moments. Someone caring enough to try and understand Makaku is what he wanted, though I doubt he understood that fully himself. Compassion was outside his experience. This time, he would die knowing that someone both knew and cared. The arc closes with Alita weeping for Makaku after his death, unsure if she feels hatred or mourns him. It's a moment of pity, but also hope. Hope and compassion has won out over fatalism and cruelty. What I like about how this arc uses Makaku is that it allows Alita to define herself. In contrast to Makaku, Alita is a figure of both strength and compassion. She is defined as someone that will fight for others, both those she has relationships with and strangers. She will even show compassion for someone as deeply twisted as Makaku. She also stands as someone determined to choose her own destiny. With all that being said, I do actually have some problems with this arc. Most of what I just described really only takes form in the last chapter or two. This arc is very backloaded. Early on, Makaku is just presented as a brute. That isn't too big a problem. You expect a character to get more developed over the course of an arc, but some more insightful stuff about Makaku could have been fit earlier, I think. Some ideas presented earlier in this arc also don't really go anywhere. Notably, Makaku raises the idea that his intellect is tied to his body after his first fight with Alita. This never comes up again. Similarly, the idea that Alita's berserker body might influence her to be more violent is also raised, but goes nowhere. That might come back a tiny bit in the next arc, but it definitely doesn't here. It sort of feels like the author's thoughts on this arc didn't really come together until he was halfway through writing it. Lastly, I want to comment a bit on the art. The art in this arc is rougher than his later work, as you might expect from a fairly early point in the artist's career. Proportions are sometimes a bit wonky. The relative size of characters, especially Makaku, can be inconsistent at times. On the other hand, there are some really great panels here. Kishiro does a tremendous job cementing this grungy yet colossal environment that is the scrapyard. There are great action scenes and character poses here. You really get drawn into appreciating Alita as this powerful, beautiful character, especially in her final battle with Makaku. At times, Makaku's violence comes across as more cartoonish than horrifying, but maybe that's just me. And I'm not sure I really would have wanted it to be more graphic. Okay, I'm going to try and do a quick summary of my thoughts. The Makaku arc does a great job of establishing the scrapyard as a setting and introducing Alita's heroic qualities. It does that by using a truly detestable villain to highlight those qualities, while also embodying the worst extremes of the scrapyard and how they can twist someone that didn't have to end up that way. It also has some kick-ass art, though it does show that the artist was still developing. That's all I have to say for now. I hope that rambling made some sense and I didn't get repetitive. Let me know what you think of this arc and Makaku as an antagonist in the comments. I'll see about getting some review videos up for the next arc. Have a nice day.